Hi, everyone. Welcome to our channel, Pat. Douglas Macgregor contends that Washington shows little concern for the desires or necessities of the American people. He argues against continued funding for Ukraine, stating that it has become evident that the war is unwinnable and has resulted in significant casualties and economic devastation. Macgregor suggests that if there were any empathy in Washington, efforts would be made to halt the conflict. He also notes that the Russians have shown restraint in their military actions, likely due to their desire for a subdued resolution. Ultimately, what the Russians want to do is resume their global business, especially with the Europeans, particularly the Germans, with whom they had strong relations. This is evidence that the majority of people in the Senate are primarily responsive to their donors, prioritizing what fills their pockets. While they do show some interest in their constituents to keep production lines running, most of the allocated funds will go into production with little immediate aid reaching Ukraine. The idea of spending money on Taiwan for defense against assumed Chinese aggression is baseless. There's no imminent danger to Taiwan unless provoked by aggressive military deployments from outside forces. As for Israel, its economy relies heavily on external aid, and without it, the economy could collapse due to the significant allocation of resources to the military. The situation in Israel is escalating, and the complexity of the crisis seems underestimated in Washington. The bottom line is that the American people must acknowledge the reality that they are not adequately represented in Washington. There's more interest in diluting national identity and cohesion by welcoming millions of people from disparate backgrounds than in safeguarding the well-being and security of Americans. Despite claims to the contrary, there are still many Americans who prioritize the country's interests, although their voices are often overshadowed in Washington's political landscape. Well, we need to consider that while we are providing financial support for aid that could reach Gaza and other areas, the reality is grim. There are approximately 500,000 people on the brink of starvation, not to mention the dire lack of access to clean water and sanitation. Within the next few months, the likelihood of 500,000 deaths in Gaza is alarmingly high. Despite claims that Israel is provided with what it needs for defense, the events of October 7th were tragic and unacceptable. It seems evident that a grave mistake occurred, perhaps due to lax security measures despite advanced surveillance violence capabilities. This isn't merely about defending Israel. It's part of a broader agenda to expand Israel's dominance in the region, often at the expense of Arab populations in Gaza and the West Bank. While I've always supported the existence of the Israeli state, I cannot condone the destruction of Arab lives in Gaza. Criticism of such actions is often met with unwarranted labels like bigotry or anti-Semitism, even from Jewish communities in the U.S. The reality is that Washington's moral posturing often overlooks egregious acts committed in Israel, driven primarily by financial interests. Americans need to recognize that money dictates much of Washington's foreign and defense policies, determining their direction and impact. I like to refer to them as billionaire oligarchs. We often discuss oligarchs in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, noting how Putin has either neutralized or aligned them with Russian national interests. However, our oligarchs seem disconnected from the realities of our country. Regarding the Senate's division on subsidies for entities beyond U.S. borders, it's apparent that any change is merely superficial. My colleague isn't likely to alter his stance. He's closely allied with Chuck Schumer and actively supports keeping borders open. We're aware of the migrant camps in Darien, Panama, where individuals from various parts of the world converge. Despite the harrowing experiences faced by women and children during their journeys, such atrocities are often overlooked. Upon arrival, they're provided financial assistance, cell phones, and free tickets to destinations of their choice. Airlines and bus terminals are directed to facilitate their transportation. The underlying aim appears to be a demographic shift, turning traditionally red states into politically blue ones, ultimately altering the fundamental fabric of America. This agenda persists unchecked because of a lack of substantial opposition. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that Tucker is a remarkably brave individual. He's well aware of the risks involved in interviewing the Russian head of state, especially considering the current tensions between Washington and Moscow. While there's no declared war, the U.S. is deeply involved in supporting Ukraine, both financially and through advisory and clandestine efforts. From the government's perspective, and that of many in Washington, Tucker's actions might be seen as undermining these efforts by seeking the truth from a foreign leader. Personally, I found most of what Putin said to be truthful and accurate, except for one area where I wasn't surprised but was disappointed. The issue lies in Russia's failure to come to terms with its Stalinist and communist past. While it's widely known that communism was a catastrophe, many Russians aren't fully aware of the extent of the atrocities committed between 1918 and the start of World War II. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939 enables Stalin's expansionist ambitions, resulting in the deaths of millions in Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, this history is often overshadowed by discussions as focusing solely on Hitler and Germany. It's essential to understand that communism's rise and subsequent brutality played a significant role in shaping the events leading up to World War I, including the fears that fueled Hitler's ascent in Germany. Those who weren't deliberately starved to death through the removal of food, the destruction of families and property faced other atrocities. They were either shot on sight, subjected to rape and execution, or deported. The difference between the concentration camps established in the 1920s and those in Eastern Europe under German occupation lies in the severity of conditions. In Russia, where temperatures plummet and provisions were scarce, prisoners often succumbed to exposure within months. The death toll between 1918 and 1941 possibly surpassed that of the Second World War itself. Many fail to grasp that numerous Soviet citizens, including Russians, Ukrainians, and various ethnic groups, aligned with the Germans against communism. Even when Hitler refused their assistance, the ideological divide was evident. While communism doesn't absolve Hitler as a responsibility, it reshapes our understanding of the conflict's origins. Stalin's strategic misjudgments, including supplying resources to the Axis power cars, fueled the war's dynamics. Despite efforts to conceal the truth, glimpses of Stalin's atrocities emerged until the early 2000s, stirring public outrage. Today, acknowledging the full extent of communist brutality remains a challenge in Russia. While couldn't confront Putin on this matter, the absence of truth-telling perpetuates misconceptions about the past. It's essential to recognize the stark realities of communism's legacy. Even as contemporary Russia strives for a more humane existence, reminiscent of its pre-Soviet era. Well, it's important to consider that when Putin talks about the big questions, they differ from what many might expect. He could have started his version of history from 1989, highlighting how Russia felt provoked into action in eastern Ukraine. They repeatedly warned against NATO expansion to their borders, a request ignored as NATO expanded into Poland and the Baltic states, historically anti-Russian territories. This expansion, in my view, heightened tensions unnecessarily. While Putin didn't emphasize these points as strongly as I do, he did underscore how Ukraine was being weaponized against Russia, a reality I appreciate him acknowledging. The key questions aren't about Putin's purported evil intentions or desires to attack the West, which I believe are irrelevant. Rather, Putin's observation about America's involvement in Ukraine and his $34 trillion debt strikes a chord. He questions why America engages in foreign meddling when it faces significant domestic challenges. This critique resonates with Washington's early ideals of becoming a model of prosperity, an idea we seem to have strayed from. Despite our flaws, America's reputation globally hasn't suffered as severely as one might expect. People still want to believe in the values America claims to embody, even as our humility has given way to arrogance and ignorance. While the world may not have fully grasped our shortcomings, there's a growing awareness of them. Yes, I don't believe people have a comprehensive grasp of the facts surrounding this issue. Looking at the broader picture, his recounting of history from 932 until now serves to remind people of Russia's endurance through numerous wars and hardships. Despite suffering, the Russian state persists with its 140 million citizens, asserting their presence and identity. He emphasizes that Russia isn't going anywhere and calls for recognition of its national identity, culture, language, and religion, values he perceives as essential to many nations' identities.